Hi students, and welcome to our next online lecture. As has been indicated, we are now looking at sub-Saharan Africa, and at least one of these terms should be immediately somewhat recognizable, and that is trypanosomiasis. That's how you say it. More commonly known as sleeping sickness, but it's a disease you read about earlier. You also actually did read about Swidden agriculture, but in the Gilbert and Reynolds reading, it was called shifting cultivation. But that is the same thing. Swidden agriculture and shifting cultivation describe the same exact agricultural technology. But there will be a new term that's only introduced during this lecture. You won't be able to get it anywhere else, and that's wealth in people. So today's lecture focuses on sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm really pulling on the theme of the history of technology interacting dynamically with environmental history and intellectual history, how ideas of nature and the environment affect human societies in the past. So I'm really focusing on those two, though inevitably there are others we could pull on. I also want to emphasize in this lecture, though, the interconnections between sub-Saharan Africa and other regions of the world. This is something that isn't nearly as well known as it really ought to be. And so I'm making that a particularly strong focus today. But in any case, this is where we're going in the lecture today. Before we get there, though, I want to reiterate what the textbook did, that there are some broad interconnections anywhere we go in the world within the tropics, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. They share a lot of similarities. You should have had a sense of that also from Gilbert and Reynolds. But there are some important distinctions that do, in many cases, place Africa in a regional category of its own. And so I want to just doubly emphasize this. So this is your first lecture question, right, number one, and your responses to this. This is mainly from the textbook, and it's something you should have focused on while doing the textbook reading. So I hope it's not too difficult. So, what distinguishes the farming in Asia, tropical Asia, to that of tropical Africa that make it easier, that make it better? That'll be your first one. But to begin with, I actually want to talk about the ways in which sub-Saharan Africa was interconnected with the rest of the world, and it has a lot to do with the geographical realities of the continent. So, the interconnections between sub-Saharan Africa and the Red Sea world are actually much easier to trace. This region doesn't provide nearly as many barriers as others for there to be broad interactions across this area. So we're really focusing on what we call the Horn of Africa on into what we call the Sahel, this region right here, all the way across the continent. We can see these kinds of interconnections if we look at the history of spread of religion, for instance. So this map shows you the spread of Christianity in red and the spread of Islam in black. There were Christians in East Africa before there were Christians in Scandinavia, in Europe. And some did maintain the religion up until the modern era. Islam came later, but did spread across the Sahara Desert and via the Red Sea world. And we can see these interconnections too if we look at language families in this region. So the Afro-Asiatic family right here in blue is actually closely related to that of the Arabian Peninsula. So Amharic, one of the languages of Ethiopia, is closely related to Hebrew and to Arabic. So this was really a cultural region in the world and isn't separable by continent the way we typically do it. In terms of major early kingdoms, early polities, the most famous one in the Horn of Africa is the Ethiopian Empire, and it was explicitly a Christian empire. In the 1100s, there were about a dozen of these stone churches carved under King Lalibela, and if you look at the image on the right, it's literally carved down into rock and then hollowed out. Really remarkable example of architecture that you only see in a few other places in the world, but this was a major trade hub in the region, and as you read for Gilbert and Reynolds, Ethiopia was the site of some of the most interesting, unique agricultural innovations anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. But it remained fairly isolated, and so some of the things grown there weren't grown anywhere else. Some of the techniques just couldn't be transferred. It had sort of a unique geography that had to do with the fact that it's in the highlands, something you should be familiar with Gilbert and Reynolds. So the Red Sea world, oh, and this is a liturgical text from the Ethiopian church. It's written in their ancient language, Ge'ez, kind of like many Catholic documents are still in Latin. It's just a liturgical language. It isn't spoken, but it's closely related to Amharic. Now, what about trans-Saharan connections? Interaction across the Red Sea was not very difficult. A basic kind of boat would be enough to interconnect that region. But what about across the Sahara, one of the world's largest and harshest, largest deserts and one of its harshest environments? So that's your next question. What kinds of technology or resources allowed people to travel across the Sahara and to travel, to trade, to interact, to influence each other across the Sahara? Put down number 2. Now you see these trans-Saharan routes. This represents probably around after the year 1000 for sure to have all of these interconnections, but you can see just how extensive the trading networks were across the Sahara. Now, you wouldn't travel across such a difficult region if you didn't have very good, and you would probably guess very profitable reasons for doing so. So if you look here at this key down here, gold and salt were some of the most important items, and you see sites of gold production anyway in G all around here. In fact, some ancient Roman coins were coined using West African gold. So we know that these are quite ancient sources of gold for the Middle East and for Europe. Around the year 0, these routes started to be pioneered, and like I said, it took about 1,000 years before they became as extensive as this, with a few really important hubs. I'm going to point out 2. Timbuktu right here, which is also at the bend of the Niger or Niger River, which runs like this. Djenné right here, down here in this other bend of the river. These are important trading towns, places where caravans that went across the Sahara would pick up new items and bring trade goods from across the desert. But what were they using to get across the desert? Excuse me. So one of the reasons why Djenné and Timbuktu were such important locations is they really were on the border of 2 different environments in West Africa. They were near the forests, which lead into rainforests in West Africa, and where it becomes much, much drier, but where agriculture is still possible. That area that grew, not cassava, excuse me, that grew, oh, I'm blanking, sorghum and millet. Those regions are right around Timbuktu, but further south it gets much, much wetter and very different kinds of agriculture are possible. But within those forests, there are important resources like kola nuts, which was a major trade good. This was an original ingredient, by the way, in Coca-Cola. So we're talking about these sort of forest zones right in here, meeting the drier areas a little further north. So what did it take? Well, it took what was known as the ships of the Sahara, camels. They still are in use today in many parts of the Sahara, usually trading in salt, as you see here, and there's some major sources of salt in the desert itself. But why? Why are camels well suited for desert travel? That's your next one. What characteristics do they include? Now, by about the year 0, camels were first used in North Africa, and very soon after began to cross the Sahara Desert. And they were able to do this. They originated in the Middle East, in the desert lands there, because of a few really unique physical features that are terribly important before any kind of trans-Saharan trade was possible. Now, that includes really large feet. They're actually sort of like the size of dinner plates. This is important for walking in sand because it enables the animal to get much better footing than if they had much smaller feet. They actually have 3 different eyelids, which helps with blowing sand, and one of them actually goes, instead of vertically, it actually goes from one side to the other, which seems kind of weird, but very important when you're traveling in an environment that can kick up a lot of sand. Finally, they have the ability to close off their nostrils almost completely, which again keeps sand out of their system. So without camel pastoralism, without that kind of technology, it'd be utterly impossible for any people to cross an environment as harsh as the Sahara. And it was the means by which Islam spread to West Africa, Islamic learning, making Timbuktu one of the most important centers of Islamic learning in all of Africa, still home to both amazing mosques and to libraries of texts. They tend to be written in the local language, but using Arabic script. So this is a major source of much history in the region. And we have famous travelers, like you read in the textbook chapter today. Ibn Battuta traveled across the Sahara using one of these caravan routes to visit Timbuktu. He went down the Red Sea region to interact with that world, and he even interacted with the Swahili coast of East Africa. So he's like bringing together all three of the major routes and conduits by which sub-Saharan Africa was vitally a part of other regions. Again, the site of some monumental architecture too, at Djenné. The mosque was originally built in 1200, but it's been rebuilt constantly since then. You wouldn't have a mud building last quite that long, I'm afraid. Finally, and this is a way or a means of interconnection that you most definitely read about in the chapter, the Indian Ocean actually acted as a conduit for trade and for mutual influence, linking East Africa and specifically the Swahili coast, this language the Swahili coast of East Africa, with the Middle East, with Southern Asia, even with Southeast Asia. Now, as the textbook made clear, it was fairly rare for a ship to leave somewhere in China and reach all the way down into Sofala, right here. And the reverse is true. For the most part, we're talking about small regional trade networks, but they linked up. And so you did get Chinese porcelain in East Africa. You did get East African ivory in China. It was possible to move these goods around very broad geographies. And it began incredibly early, by about the year 500. There were broad interconnections across this ocean. And we don't see that across the Atlantic Ocean. We don't see that across the Pacific Ocean. So that's my next question. What geographical characteristics of this ocean make it easier to navigate than other oceans? And I think this is a good image for you to look at. Geographical or any other characteristic of the Indian Ocean you might know, certainly from the textbook chapter. What makes it so good? Now, I'm sure some of you talked about how there's land all over the place on 3 out of the 4 sides of the ocean, which meant that you could stay very close in to land and be okay. But one of the most important features is the fact that spring and summer, the winds can push a vessel from the south to the north and vice versa the other way. And what's important about this is not only can you get to a very different region in the Indian Ocean, if you just wait a few months, it means you can get back home. And that is truly significant. Not many people wish to start a voyage unless they know that there is a way for them to return, certainly if they're doing this for commerce. So this is one of the major ways that East Africa remained interconnected with much of the rest of the world. Now, it wouldn't also be possible without the right kinds of sailing technologies. You read about dhows in the chapter, but I just wanted to point out one thing in particular that I don't think they emphasized enough. In terms of sailing technology, this triangular or lateen sail, right here, is important because it allows a ship not only to sail with the wind at its back, but to actually be able to sail at different angles to the wind through tacking and being able to use their sail in more creative ways. They're able to move it, for instance, based on where the wind is. If you do any kind of sailing, this might make perfect sense to you. If you aren't, just trust me, this shape of sail enables you to sail in ways that the wind itself is not necessarily dictating, and that's terribly important. This is an Indian Ocean technology, something that wasn't innovated anywhere else in the world. All right, so through important, significant technologies, it was possible to connect with sub-Saharan Africa, even though there were pretty significant barriers, such as the Sahara Desert and the Indian and Atlantic Oceans on one side or the other. Now I want to shift into more environmentally rooted technologies, specifically different kinds of agricultural technologies, as well as some ideas of connected to nature across many sub-Saharan African cultures. And it'll be here that we'll definitely get to that maybe odd-looking key term, wealth in people. So to begin with, you read an entire chapter on the challenges that the African environment poses for those who wish to live there. It's a difficult environment in which to live, and so you already have a good sense of the problems with a geologically inactive, older soil throughout much of the continent, problems with rainfall, the fact that rain is frequently seasonal and occasionally far too intense to work well with agriculture. It's certainly not possible to grow certain kinds of crops in these conditions. For instance, wheat can't grow throughout much of sub-Saharan Africa. You need the wetter crops to be able to grow. And finally, disease. You read both about, you read about malaria, yellow fever, and trypanosomiasis as three of the major diseases of the African continent, all of which are environmentally rooted. Now, when you take together all these things, it shouldn't come as any surprise when you look at figures like this. Now, this is just China, no other part of Asia. This is all of Europe at 1200, so pretty much half of the Chinese population. South and Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam, Thailand, etc. 100 million, significant, and in India as well with South Asia, significant population there. You compare all of that to just Africa, and you see that it is truly an underpopulated region. And that has everything to do with the conditions in which people lived, and very little to do with the kinds of technological innovations they themselves came up with. In a different environment, it's likely they would have done just as well as any other people, all things being equal. We talked about some of the variations in vegetation in regions where life was easier. Certainly the highlands of Ethiopia, of Kenya, of parts of Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, down into southern Africa, there are some regions that are much easier to survive in. They just sort of have that combination of qualities that we already talked about. Not only are there better soils because they're volcanic, but they tend to be environments that are too cold for those insects that bring disease to live, and so you don't have many mosquitoes, you don't have any tsetse flies, and so it's impossible to have malaria, to have yellow fever, or to have trypanosomiasis in any of these locations. Then there are the regions that are incredibly wet, like the rainforests of Central and West Africa. It's actually too wet in many of these places to set up a agricultural community that can survive with much ease. If you think about it, the tree canopy actually is a problem in rainforests because it prevents sunlight from reaching the crops you might want to grow in a particular area, and the rainfall can be too intense at times. It can actually wash away crops rather than helping you out. Most landscape, as you read, is savanna. That would be the region in these lighter green colors, and you see that that does cover most of the rest of the continent. Agriculture is absolutely possible here, but the fact of the matter is, for most of these regions, except for the highlands, it's just not very good soil, not very good growing conditions. Oh yes, and this is a good map of the distribution of both yellow fever and trypanosomiasis, but do keep in mind these are contemporary maps. So they would have probably been far spottier. There'd be far more areas that were free of these insects in the distant past, like we're talking about. So that's important to note. So how did these general growing conditions affect Africans' ideas of nature? And this, we're talking very broadly across the continent, so it's impossible to use just one idea for, in some cases, thousands of different ethnic groups, but remarkably, there are a few concepts that we see widely across the continent. And we're talking about a period around 1200 to 1500. To begin with, when you look at this distribution of population, it's very clear Africa was underpopulated in this period. Now that means, unlike Europe and unlike Asia, land is not scarce. It's not overly populated in Africa. So if land isn't scarce, and land isn't very productive, what becomes the scarce resource, the thing that everybody wants to have control over, is not land like we see in medieval Europe and China. It's not land, it's people, it's labor, it's your ability to make land productive because you control the people who are necessary to bring it into production. And so historians of Africa refer to this term as wealth in people, that it was a major desire on most Africans' parts to create interconnections between them and other people, especially to create followings. I'll give you some examples soon, but this abundance of land leads to certain social characteristics that might distinguish this region from others. So, to begin with, anybody who can put land to productive use tended to have a right to that land. But it's only for as long as they can make it productive. So it's not an absolute property ownership regime that we see throughout much of sub-Saharan Africa. But in areas where there are high populations that are well established, there might be much more control over land than that. And that just simply makes sense. It's about supply and demand. Now, typically, any kind of land had to be distributed by someone. It wasn't just a free-for-all. There tended to be a lot of regulation, actually, over how you would gain access to land. So there's empty land. You don't have any land, so you go and you talk to the person whose family has been established in a region, and that's just known as the first settler in an area. Now, you also could, in lands that are in regions that are higher populated, could only gain access to land through your family. So some kind of family connection, some kind of clan connection. It's through your own descent and your connections to other people. Or, again, these are in better lands, in lands where there's denser population. These prime lands were only distributed by prominent people locally, the chief, the monarch, a king, a queen, an emperor, whatever it happened to be, and this was a major source of their political power. So, in regions where land is scarce, it is tightly controlled and important for the political elites. Where it's much more open, it's relatively easy to gain access to it, but there still are regulations and means for people to gain access to it. In this part, this is more the social history of the environment, and we do see this very frequently throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Now, as I said, this concept of wealth in people refers to the notion that high social status and a great amount of power doesn't come from the amount of products or goods or high-value commodities that a person has, which is, I think, what we usually think of as being a source of wealth. Instead, in contrast to that idea, throughout many sub-Saharan African societies, wealth was measured in the interconnections between you and other people, your ability to call upon others to help you. Now, there's a variety of ways by which this would happen. Some of them are ones that you have. If you needed help painting a house, something like that, some big job, there are ways that you could call upon others to help. So one is to call upon everybody who's connected to you, related to you, who is younger. So that's children or juniors. So if your great aunt calls you up and asks you to help with your computer, you probably will go and help her, right? It's that same notion. As you read in Gilbert and Reynolds, polygamy or polygyny was widespread, so another way to enhance one person's ability to call upon others would be to have many wives and to therefore have many children. Now again, this was rare. It was difficult and expensive, and just based on pure numbers, it couldn't be done by many men, but it was an ideal. Now you could have really extensive ideas of who you're connected to, and that's what we refer to as clan. The idea of a clan is that you all claim to have a common ancestor, but it's so distant in the past that no one could ever prove it by creating family trees and whatnot. But you have a sense that you are somehow connected, somehow related. and clans tended to be widely distributed across a region. So you could go even into a group that spoke a slightly different language and find a clan member there. And they would be obligated to help you. You are obligated to help them whenever you see them. You read about age grades, age sets in Gilbert and Reynolds, so I hope you have a good sense of what that meant, but it was a way to create some kind of comradeship amongst people who were exactly the same age. Clients. Now, this is a more unique feature, and I think it's one of the easiest to grasp wealth in people through. If there is a prominent person in a particular area, somebody who controls really good farmland, someone has a lot of cows, who actually has a lot of wealth through trade or something else, they can attach poorer people, more marginal people to them through what we call clientship, or a patron-client relationship. That richer person, the patron, gives the client something of high value. So that's a cow. That's really great farmland. That's new kinds of farming tools that have just come into fashion, specialized seeds, any of those things. Give them something that is incredibly productive, important, difficult to acquire if you're just a poor person. They become the client of the patron. Now, if the patron ever needs any kind of assistance, if they want to plant a new field, if they need help harvesting or processing, anything like that, the client is obligated to drop whatever they're doing and help out the patron. The flip side of this is that the patron has already given the client something really important, something that can be productive and help them in their future. But it also means that if the client is ever in any kind of trouble, if their crops fail, for instance, and they're starving, they can call upon the patron for help, and that patron also is obligated to help them. But patronage is one of the major ways that prominent people could create connections outside of their own family. You notice that a lot of the first ones just have to do with a family's own reproductive growth, and that's pretty limited. Pawns are a similar category in times of distress. If a marginal family is about to starve, something like that, they could place one of their junior members, one of their children, with a local person who's doing better, somebody who might have planted a variety of foods rather than just one, someone who can survive. And in return for that person they've placed in their household, that family in distress can receive food and aid, anything they need to keep going. This in no sense is selling off children. It's not slavery. If you think about it, at least that pawn, the original family knows, will be well fed and cared for, because wealth is in people. Finally, there were indigenous systems of slavery. They're nothing like plantation slavery as we know it from American history. Again, because wealth is in people, even slaves were valued pretty highly, and in some cases they were able to marry into their master's family or eventually join the family itself. It was quite a bit different from what we see in other slave systems. Now, how does this general context of scarcity and a difficult environment play into how Africans thought about their environment? I think there are a few ways we can see this. To begin with, there were extensive systems, and in each society there'd be a different name for it, of both ancestor spirits and nature spirits. Ancestors obviously are the people who came before you in your own family. It's believed after death they remain able to affect the living and were particularly interested in the well-being of their descendants. But there also were nature spirits, which were located in particular localities, and they were supposed to control the resources of that locality. So if you wanted to be able to process salt in a region, a place that has good salt pans, something like that, you would need to venerate and honor the local nature spirit, or you believed it would not go well for you. You wouldn't be able to produce much. In particular, ancestor spirits are supposed to provide for the health and the prosperity of their families. If you think about it, maybe one of the reasons why so many African societies had these extensive systems is because they were living in such difficult circumstances. So they believed that their fates in part hinged on what the spiritual world desired for them, but there were ways in which Africans believed they could affect the outcome by honoring spirits, venerating them, whether they were ancestors or nature spirits in that particular dimension. We also see this state of there being a lot of disease throughout sub-Saharan Africa, really informing ideas of politics locally. So to begin with, it's important to think about how Africans thought about health. The main idea here is that the ability to regenerate oneself, either a community or an individual in terms of having children, that is what people believed health to really mean. It wasn't just about physical well-being, but the ability to regenerate, to continue. Political leaders claimed that they could guarantee this by providing abundance, by providing fertility, and they claimed this, and we see this in many, many different African societies. They claimed this because they would say, in my family, our ancestors are powerful, and they're more powerful than yours. And the other way that they could claim it would be to say that their family controls what were known as rain-making medicines to produce rain at times when people would need it. Remember, rainfall is highly varied and can be absolutely destructive, and these people, these political leaders, are claiming they can actually control rain. And on here they did refer to these as medicines, and that might sound kind of strange, but the notion amongst many sub-Saharan African peoples that a medicine is a substance that can transform material reality. So it can transform your body by reducing fever, by making a bellyache better, that sort of thing. But they also believed that medicines could transform the natural world as well, including the production of rain. Sorry, that was not working. Now, when you post a question or a comment, if some of these ideas didn't quite make sense to you, you should consider putting it on there. Wealth and people, I hope you can define it. Think about how that helped to shape or change African society, this general notion of wealth and people. In terms of dating, it's an ancient idea, and frankly, we have no way of dating it. So if you just say ancient, I will be fine with that. And to wind up this lecture, I want to go through a few African agricultural technologies, just to reiterate some things you've learned in Gilbert and Reynolds, and to introduce you to a few things that might not have been as well covered. So, if we look at West Africa, especially in the regions where there's dense rainforest, there are a few, that'd be right here. There are a few important agricultural technologies. You read about the importance of yam cultivation in this region. Essentially, it's too wet for any kind of grain to grow. Millet, any of the other indigenous African grains cannot be grown in this region, just too wet. The only thing that can be grown is the yam. And you read about it, that it's certainly limited in terms of nutrition. But one of the real downsides to this is it takes something like 20 adult men to clear away enough land to create a yam farm to feed one family. Now think about that. 20 adult men. That is well more than a typical family would include. So I hope immediately you understand the importance of wealth and people in this particular context. You need to be able to call upon 20 other adult men to make it possible for just one family to survive. I'm actually going to skip some of this, but I wanted to show you what pearl millet looked like, as does sorghum. So these are the two indigenous African grain crops that were grown throughout sub-Saharan Africa. So further north, in areas that were less wet, that wouldn't drown out these were grown. Finally, in West Africa, in this region right here, basically the Senegal and the Niger River, was the site of indigenous African rice growing. We'll talk about this when we talk about the Atlantic world, but I just wanted to make you aware of it, just to kind of reiterate. It wasn't in the book reading, but wanted to put that out there. Now in Southern Africa, we see various possibilities depending on where we're talking about in Southern Africa. Now where you could incorporate cattle into an agricultural society, life was far more stable and far more possible to create trading and political settled structures. So if we look at this empire down here in today's Zimbabwe, it's an area where you see even today there's very few tsetse flies, so it means it's perfectly possible to keep cattle in this region. They combined the African grains, millet and sorghum, with cattle keeping and were able to create a fixed society because they could incorporate cattle manure into their agricultural mix. They also were producers of gold in this region and engaged in Indian Ocean-based trade. And so we see the rise of a major political power in this region, known as Great Zimbabwe, from about 1200, and it peaked around 1400. But it was an extensive society. The king was responsible for distributing land and distributing cattle to his followers. A place where a settled society was really made possible by the incorporation of cattle. Now, not too far away, up in today's Zambia, up here, amongst the Bemba ethnic group, situation was quite a bit different. This was actually a tsetse-fly zone, so no cattle were possible. They grew the same kind of grains as in Great Zimbabwe, but because they didn't have the ability to enhance the fertility of the soil, they actually had to engage in swidden agriculture, which is the same as shifting cultivation. They couldn't grow on the same field for more than about 3 harvests. That was it. Then they had to move on to a new region, cut down all the vegetation, burn it in order to mix the ash in with the soil, and that enabled them to get another decent crop. But what you need to think about here is the immense labor requirements that that put on this particular people, and the fact that they would have to move so frequently in order to find fields that were ready to go. Still, it enabled them to create a society and to keep their families going. And by the way, if you're wondering what most Africans were doing with all these grains, they actually were producing this white substance. So you take any kind of flour, it could be millet, it could be sorghum. Later on, when maize is introduced to Africa, they'll make it out of maize. You just boil it in water and produce this kind of stiff porridge, is how a lot of people will describe it. But it's drier. You actually work it around in your hands, and you kind of make it into a scooping surface, and you would scoop any kind of meat, beans, vegetable that was being produced. So it's completely typical throughout Eastern and Southern Africa as a major part of their diet. Okay, we're getting long, so I just want to give you one more example of some pretty interesting agricultural possibilities. So if you look at this region up here, we call this the Great Lakes in East Africa, and you'll notice how many ancient kingdoms and empires are here. In all these blank spaces, we're talking about much smaller societies. It might just be the village level, up until very recent times. But there are a lot of these high, dense and extensive and complicated political structures right here in this region. So you already know that the highlands are a good area. In terms of soil, it's volcanic. In terms of health, there are very few tsetse flies or mosquitoes. But you have to have the right kind of crop to flourish. And across the Indian Ocean trade routes, the banana came from Asia to Africa by very early times. Probably by the year 0, it was in Madagascar. It took about a couple hundred years to reach East Africa, a couple hundred more to reach the Great Lakes. By the year 1000, it's well established in throughout East Africa, but flourishing beyond belief in the Great Lakes regions. The banana is an incredibly productive plant. We know it as a really sweet food, something we eat for breakfast or in a dessert or something like that, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different varieties of bananas, and some of them are quite starchy and kind of taste like a potato. But you look at the amount of food that each one of these banana plants produces, and it's simply enormous. It's the largest amount of food per unit of land compared to anything, more than maize, more than any kind of grain, etc. And it doesn't take much work, actually, to grow these, so they're kind of perfect. But this just gives you a sense of some of the variety of bananas in East Africa, each one with a different flavor, each one with a different purpose. Some of these, let me see, these ones up here are only used in brewing beer. Banana beer might make you think of something with a banana taste, but it does not. It's just beery. But this is the typical way that most folks in East Africa eat bananas. But the cultivation of bananas meant that the Great Lakes kingdoms in East Africa were able to grow tremendously in population. It meant that land became an incredibly high-value, difficult-to-acquire commodity, and so the political elites who controlled land gained more and more and more power. In this image, you see a ton of different banana trees all around, but it really caused a huge increase in this region in terms of population. And influenced the way people talked about things like marriage. In Buganda, the verb to marry is to cause somebody to peel a banana. And different kinds of banana tools were given at the point of marriage, usually from the groom's family to the bride's family. So, the very last part of this, all I want you to do is to write out a key term from this week, the same way you would for the exam. So, define it, put it in time and place, and give an interpretation of its historical significance. So it's a little longer this time, I know, for the lecture itself, but I'm hoping the other parts to this won't take you as long as that first one. So, post me what I require. Thanks.